All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Ryan Sharp at Enso Winery in Portland. It's March 9th, 2023. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Heck yeah.
First question, why wine?
Well, because beer is super filling and spirits get me really drunk really fast. But you probably mean, why did I get into wine? Okay. Because wine's pretty much all I drink anymore. Although when we started Enso, so we have like three beer taps here. And the whole reason that we had beer here when we started was because we would drink beer while we were making wine. That's like I know it's like, how many gallons of beer does it take to make a bottle of wine? But like, we really did drink beer a lot. I can't do beer anymore. Anyway, so getting into wine, so I had a handful of other careers before winemaking, and I guess my zeal for wine started when I lived in San Francisco, which is probably my oldest son's 16, so it was like 17, 18 years ago. Lived in San Francisco. I, like many young Californians at the time, drank $2 Chuck. And I remember when we moved to San Francisco from Southern California, there was a guy who was kind of a mentor of mine for a couple of years. He would introduce me to not like fine wines, but like good wines, like real wines. And so my palate started to adjust. In fact, so much so that I distinctly remember the time when my ex-wife and I, she was my wife then, when we were invited to a dinner party and they were serving $2 Chuck, and I remember thinking, fuck, I'm really a snob because I can't drink this. And it wasn't even like, oh, I'm not gonna drink it. It's like, no, now I know that that's actually really bad. Anyway, okay. So $2 Chuck, my mentor in San Francisco, not wine mentor, more like spiritual mentor, introduced me to good wine. Start wine tasting. Of course, California is just so full of wine tasting. And of course, you start in Napa and Sonoma and maybe Mendocino. But the place that I fell in love with was the Sierra foothills. So, like an hour east of Sacramento in old gold country, you have all these little wineries. I'm sure there's big ones, especially now out there, because it's such a great wine growing region. Probably my favorite wine growing region in the state of California. But what was cool was that I would go out there with friends, and you might actually be talking with the winemaker at the winery. It wasn't like Napa. I mean, Napa, you get that in a very few select number of places, but most of Napa, they say it's like wine Disney World now, and it really does have that feel where you're pampered, but you're not seeing dirt underneath the fingernails in Napa Valley, right? It's like it's not like that. But in the Sierras, you do see that, and I started to have this dream of when I retire, in my 60s or whatever, that I would buy a small plot of land in Mariposa County, so right up against Yosemite, and I'd plant maybe 3 to 5 acres. And at that time, all I could focus on was Zinfandel and Petit Syrah, and that would be, I'd tend to the vines, I'd make the wines, I wouldn't distribute, I'd just sell them out of my barn. And so that was a dream of mine. And so this is 16, 17 years ago. And here's the thing about the Sierra foothills and about it being these smaller wineries is a lot of the people that own these wineries, they're not second, third generation winemaking families. They were city commissioners, or they were accountants, or they were musicians, and now they're next phase of life, I want to start a winery. And I thought that was so normalizing. When you go to places like Napa and Sonoma, if you're a person who's like, oh, I'd love to, maybe have my own wine brand, you go to Napa and Sonoma and you're like, there's no way in hell I could ever do this. It's like, it costs, $10 million just to have an idea, much less to execute it. But you go out to, at least, back in the day, you go out to the Sierra foothills and you're like, oh, there's actually like possibility for normal people to, manage a small plot of land with not like a crap ton of money and make good wines and then be around to talk about them. So while I did not ever launch my project in California, as it would turn out, a couple years later I would move up to Oregon, I did basically make that happen in Portland. Like, that's still the genesis of my wine dream. So like, there were steps along the way, right? So I'm living in San Francisco. I was actually brewing beer at the time, which I really enjoyed that. And, again, my mentor's getting me into, nicer wines, and I'm going and talking with these really interesting winemakers in Gold Country. And by the time I land in Portland, I'm like, I want to start working for a winery, and I want to start getting education. So I went down to Chemeketa, which, although it's a community college, and I never got a degree from it because I already had my bachelor's, but not in winemaking and something else. But Chemeketa was awesome. Like, it's really inexpensive. They have great professors. Like, everything about it was awesome. And so I went there. I started working for a small winery in like kind of North Salem area. It's not there anymore, but it was called Arcane Cellars, and the vineyard was called Wheatland Vineyard. It was father-son team, and they sold the property, I think, like 2 or 3 years ago, and they all moved to Portugal. Which, good on them. I mean, that's amazing. Turns out they have grapes there too in Portugal. So I went to work for this winery in North Salem. They had me do farmers markets, they had me do in-store pourings, and then eventually I was allowed to do crush and harvest. And I realized quite quickly that I'm actually not a vineyard guy. Like, I love the idea when I didn't know about the distinctions between growing grapes and making wine. I love the idea of tending to a vineyard. But as it turned out, I really was like, I'm not a farmer, but I'm great with, like, chemistry. I'm great with, like, at home cooking. Like, this herb would go really great in here. So I have that sort of like sensual aesthetic, or like I like using the lab of flavor and aroma. I'm very comfortable in that. And also I love storytelling. So like marketing products has never been too much of a problem for me. So I realized I'm not a grape guy, or I'm not a grape farmer, but I do like wine and being around the production process. And so once I realized that I love being in the winery but not in the vineyard, I was like, well, I'm driving an hour and a half every day, in each direction down to Arcane. Like, we could probably do something like that up here in Portland where everybody lives. So I started Enso. And my whole idea with Enso was just to create a neighborhood winery. It never was about being in multiple states. It was never about being on restaurant wine lists. It was about creating a cozy environment where you wouldn't just come in and get to taste wine and ask questions, but also you might want to hang around for a bit. And the funny thing is that, like, these days, I think most people probably just think we're a wine bar. Like, they see the barrels in the back, but they probably think it's just for decoration. Which actually right now it is just for decoration. There is no wine in these barrels because they all went to tank at the beginning of this year. We blended and bottled them, so like right now they're actually empty. But they're not props. they have been used. But I'm just saying, most people sort of interact with us as a cozy wine bar. Here's one other thing I'll say about the whole like Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino distinction from Gold Country. I remember a handful of times in Napa where I'd be like, oh, I'm smelling this like, I don't know, it's like it's gunpowder or something. And the person would deadpan behind the wine bar be like, nope, that's not in there. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, I smelled it. Like, I'm not saying that you have to say, yes, you are correct, there is gunpowder in your glass. But everybody smells something and tastes something a little bit different. And when I was in Gold Country with these people who are genuinely, you know, like passionate, curious, again, this is a new career for them, a lot of them anyway. They're like, oh, that's interesting. They're like, I don't think it's reduced. I don't think it's like a sulfur thing, but they're like, I don't really get it. Like, could you describe it a little bit more? And I'm like, well, maybe I mean more like peppery. And they're like, oh, we totally get peppery. And I was like, that's how I'm gonna run Enso. I'm gonna run Enso as a place where you can make any comment about the wine or ask any question about the wine and you won't be shamed. Now, wine culture has casualized significantly in the last 20 years, like since my time in Napa. I don't know if it's casualized there, but it's broadly wine has been casualized. So I like to think that while I'm not suggesting that we were like this like huge contributing part of casualizing wine and making it less esoteric, but we certainly were a, Enso was formed in sort of opposition to the stuffiness of wine. Which is funny because the stuffy side of wine probably was in opposition to like the dumb jug wine movement. You know, it's like everything's sort of like waxing and waning, ebbing and flowing. And so like no problem with the, you know, and some people just like to go and drop $100 at a Napa winery and taste 3 wines that all taste the same, and you know, I mean, and no problem. But that's not what you're going to get at Enso. So that's why I got into wine, or how, or when, or something.
I'm going to pick you back up there in a second, but I'm curious. Tell us a little bit about life before wine and the careers you were in before coming here.
Okay. When I was a kid, I always dreamed of growing up and becoming a Christian musician. I went to Christian college. I started a band there. Before I could even graduate Christian college, my band was on the road. So for like 10 years of my life, I toured as the front man of this. We weren't that big, but we did play some big venues. Christian band. Now that's not my world anymore, but I do have like it was an amazing time in my life. Like we were in different cities almost every day, like doing the autograph things. This is what's so funny. Girls would ask me to autograph their Bibles. It's the most ridiculous thing in retrospect. I didn't write this. This is not my book. I do remember one like youth pastor guy being like, does it ever, and I was a young kid given way too much influence. I mean, I'm literally like in my young 20s and he's like, does it ever bother you like this idea of signing a Bible? And at the time I was like, no, why? But in retrospect, it's kind of weird. But it's not my world anymore, but I now look back on that time, 10 years of my life, maybe even more than that, of being a recording musician. I produced other bands. We toured. We had like a 30-foot RV with like a 20-foot trailer. I mean, it was the legit thing. We traveled to other countries and played music. And actually, when I started Enso, I was pretty much the only person who worked the bar. And people would ask me do you miss touring and playing music? And I was like, I don't. Like I had a great time doing it, but like when the next season of life happened, it wasn't like I wish I could go back and keep doing that. Like I had a good run, and then it was like time to switch things up. And so after being a performing musician for a decade or more, finished my college degree, and my first wife and I started a graphic design studio. So she was mainly the talent and I was mainly like the client liaison. And so I was working behind a computer, interacting with both the client and our subcontractors, and we produced some really beautiful stuff. And by we, I mainly mean that she produced some really beautiful stuff. Like, this was still in the age of print, so like book covers, book interiors, but then some digital stuff as well. But I got really bored of being behind a computer all the time. And so I started thinking like, oh, it'd be great to get my hands dirty. And so I was like, oh, I like making beer, but I like drinking wine. Like, let's try making wine. And so it's sort of like just through a series of things, making some wine at home, eventually working for Arcane, John Groshaw, eventually like opening Enso. Oh, I forget. This is not a first date thing that I talk about, but I'm going to tell you. Between being a Christian musician and being a graphic design partner, I was a pastor for a short period of time. So this had to be late 20s, which again just kind of blows my mind in retrospect. Like, who would give a 28-year-old spiritual authority? It's so funny. Whatever, it doesn't matter. This was another great experience. All my experiences have had beautiful moments and treacherous moments and all that stuff. But I actually was a pastor for a handful of years. I did music, I taught, and again, that's not my world anymore. I still believe in a interconnectedness of things. I actually bring that into my winemaking in some ways, and definitely bring it into the culture of Enso. That there are no strangers at Enso. Even if you're a tourist and this is the only time you'll ever set foot in here, you're met like a friend. And that is actually makes me emotional. That's funny. I got into Enso for the craft of winemaking. But what I love about Enso, and I couldn't predict that this would be the case, is the culture that Enso represents, that it inhabits, that perhaps it helped to form over the years. Said a different way, when I think about what I'm proudest about with creating Enso 12 years ago and the 12 years that have followed since its inception, I'm more proud of the culture than I am of the wine. Like, the wine is in some ways secondary. You can have good wines in sterile environments, or worse yet, in stuffy or even hostile environments. Fuck that. No way. Human to human first, product to product second, right? Or human to human first, experience to experience second, product to product last. And that is built into the core of Enso and probably any other project I'll do with the remainder of my life.
So with the experience you had when you started Enso, tell me about, outside of kind of an ethos of Enso that you had in mind, tell me about the product. Tell me about what kind of wines you wanted to make and how you learned to make them.
Right, so like I said, when I had the dream of owning property in Mariposa County, it was Zinfandel and Petit Syrah, right? And to me, those to me are the two most quintessential American grapes. Of course, they're not from here, but when I think of what is an American, what represents America in grapes, it's like Zinfandel and Petit Syrah, big and bold and kind of crass. And so I've worked with those grapes the entire time I've been here. But three other regions that I really got enamored with. Just before opening Enso to the public, me and a handful of friends took a trip to France, stayed in Paris, journeyed out to the Loire Valley. So I'm experiencing very rustic Cabernet Franc. I loved it. So that's region one. Region two, Côte du Rhône. And that's mainly because when I started Enso, I was a huge Randall Graham fan. So Bonnie Doon made the craziest, but most of them were really delicious wines, red wines. They had some other ones. They had some white wines and some sweet wines that weren't necessarily my thing, but he did some cool stuff. He did this there was this one wine that I kept buying by the case when I lived in San Francisco. It was called Heart of Darkness. I want to say it was like a French, how do you say the grape? Like Madiran, Madiran.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, it was like black as night. It was the densest color or saturation of any wine, and it was just like so perfect. I haven't had it in years, so I was a big Randall Graham fan. So like, you can't reference Randall Graham without referencing like the whole like Rhone Rangers, the whole Rhone movement in California, Topless Creek, like so Loire Valley, Côte du Rhône, and Bandol. So the guy who would be my business partner for most of the length of Enso, before he became my business partner, he was just kind of like a business consultant / friend for me. Lives in Chicago, and he's been in the wine, beer, and spirits world for quite some time, longer than me. And when I told him I was starting Enso, he sent me this bottle as kind of like a congratulations. And it was a bottle of Domaine Tempier. I'd never heard of Domaine Tempier before. I'm not even sure that I really even knew what Mourvèdre as a grape was. But drinking that bottle, I was like, I want to make this wine. So in my winemaking at Enso, yes, I still do cultivate the Zinfandel Petit Syrah. And right now we've got a Zinfandel, we've got a Primitivo, and we've got a Zinfandel Petit Syrah blend, and we've got a Petit Syrah Malbec blend. So they're still heavily a part of our portfolio, but and when we started, it was almost all varietal wines. But now most of what we make are blends. So I've got my Loire Valley blend, which is Cab Franc, Merlot, which in the Loire Valley would be called Co, and then Malbec, and that's not a Loire thing, but it rounded out the wine nicely. No, wait, yeah, Cabernet Franc, Malbec / Co, and then Merlot. Merlot softened it, because the Cab Franc was a little bit edgy that year. So that wine is called Le Fleuve, which means the river that flows to the sea. So the Loire River flows out to the Atlantic. Our Willamette Columbia River flows out to the Pacific, so I thought that was fitting. So that's Loire. Côte du Rhône, we make a wine that, I love the name of this wine. It's called Chateauneuf de Starck. So it's our play on Chateauneuf de Pop. Now, in reality these days, our Chateauneuf de Starck it's a pretty simple GSM. So it's Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, and then Counoise. And it's like equal parts, like 25, 25, 25, 25. But the whole idea of Chateauneuf de Starck started in our very first year. We're making wine in my friend's very small garage. It's all TTB licensed and everything, OLCC, everything licensed, but it was like a 600 square foot garage, or maybe smaller than that. And so what we found is that like we kept having these like leavings after press cycles. So we'd press off the Cab Franc, we'd press off the Zinfandel, we'd press off the Petit Syrah, and we had like 6 gallons of this left, and 5 gallons of this, and 14 gallons of this. So what we did was we just made a big kitchen sink blend of like, it ended up being like 7 or 8 reds, and then like a white. And I was like, who does this? Well, as it turns out, Chateauneuf de Pop does that. There's 16 grapes allowed into Chateauneuf de Pop. I think 3 of them are whites and the other 13 are reds. And you can't use any grapes other than that. But if you're within those 16 grapes, you can do whatever blend you want and call it Chateauneuf de Pop. So I was like, brilliant. It's our, we were gonna call it something like a kitchen sink blend. And it actually turned out really well. So kind of surprisingly, because we weren't like, oh, it needs more of this. No, it was just like, we have this, so let's just like keep pumping it into the barrel or the tank, and then we put it into barrel. Well, so I'm like, okay, so it's kind of a Chateauneuf de Pop style wine, not those grapes. And I was like, well, what does Chateauneuf de Pop mean? So I look it up, and I'm familiarized with like, okay, there was this time in French history where they gave a big middle finger to the Vatican, and they said, we want our own kind of Catholicism. And so they got their own pope for a little bit, and so they built a house for him, or a castle for him in Avignon, and that's what it means. The new house of the Pope, Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And so I was like, oh, that's a cool story. And then, of course, eventually the French would be like, okay, fuck it, we'll go back to the Vatican. I'm sure there was money exchanged. I'm sure there were non-disclosure agreements signed back in the 18th or 17th century, whenever that happened. I don't even know. But the point being is that I love the idea of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And so I was like, we are the new house on Stark Street. No, it's not a Game of Thrones reference. Game of Thrones didn't exist back then. And people ask us that. They're like, does it have anything to do with Game of Thrones? Is this like a Game of Thrones themed wine? It's got a castle on it and it's got the word Stark in it. Is this like Ned Stark's? I'm like, nope, the Stark Street existed. So we're the new house on Stark. So, okay, so we covered Le Fleuve, which is our Loire Valley blend. Châteauneuf-du-Stark, which is our like kind of Côte d'Aron-ish blend. L'American is our Zinfandel Petit Syrah blend. I already told you about that. And then Mourvedre. So not as a blend, but as a varietal wine. Like it was my attempt at Bandol. And we haven't produced a Mourvedre red in a few years just because the vineyard that we worked with had some pretty severe drought conditions, and they sell us grapes, but they don't sell us grapes if there's no extra grapes to sell. So that's kind of like the grape choosing. Our white wines, so we always have a white and a rosé. Our rosés are almost always rosé of Mourvedre or rosé of Grenache because I like those pale Provençal style rosés. Usually our white wines, and they've varied across the years, are it's going to be like Pinot Gris or Gewürztraminer, like a dry Gewürztraminer or a dry Riesling. We actually did a dry Müller-Thurgau one year. I just like bright, acidic white wines. We're not as married to the varietals of the white wines as we are to the reds.
I'm curious about learning. Obviously, that's not just a single varietal. I'm going to see how it turns out in the end. You're blending, you're being creative, you're thinking these kind of things through. I'm curious about the process of learning that for you. How did you go about learning winemaking, and how did it turn out?
Trial and error. It's worked out well, and it's worked out really poorly. I've dumped some barrels, that's for sure. I've actually got I've got some brandy that was made from 4 barrels that just turned to shit. Okay, but so a success story and a failure story. So which one do you want first? Okay.
Failure first.
Okay, failure first. Okay, so in the spirit of that first Châteauneuf-du-Stark that we made, I was like, I bought a brand new barrel, and I removed the head, and what I had planned to do was, so to be clear, with the original Châteauneuf-du-Stark that we did, it was blending pressed wine into a tank with a floating lid and then barreling it once we got to 60 gallons, right? But I had this idea that I wanted to try where over the course of a harvest, we would scoop out a handful of grapes from each batch, white, red, as they came in. We crushed the Malbec and we put it in the bin. We're going to scoop out, a 5-gallon bucket's worth, slosh it into this barrel. So by the time that harvest was finished, and this particular harvest, this is probably 5, 6 years ago. By the time this harvest was finished, we'd probably had like almost 3 full weeks elapse from the first grapes to the final grapes. Maybe it was like 2.5 weeks, but I had blended, basically to co-ferment and continue like extending the fermentation cycle, because every time I'm putting new stuff in, I'm basically extending the fermentation cycle a handful of days. I had to dump it all. I had a name for it. What did I call that? I had a very special name for that wine. And it was like, we were dumping it in. Yes, we were, doing punch downs to the barrel, but EA and VA just got out of control on it. I literally just had to dump it, like completely dump it. It was just 1 barrel, but it was such a disappointment because it was like, it could have been cool. I eventually would refer to it as the bastard. Maybe that's what I called it early on. I don't remember. Il Bastardo is what we called it. So it's like Italian for the bastard. I think it's Italian. So that was a failure, right? Like I was like, let's just work with nature, man. Let's just, these grapes want to become wine, man. So let's just, let's roll with it. It was so John Groshaw, who's one of my favorite winemakers in Oregon, and who certainly has been a mentor and now more friend. Like we see each other every once in a while, but early on, it's definitely a mentor, whether directly or even indirectly. And I think you could say that John Groshaw was a big participant in the Oregon wine scene as it is now, certainly in the urban wine movement back in the day. But John had this great quip about his winemaking process, and he's like, don't fuck it up. Like, don't be over involved, but don't let it go to shit either, right? Like there's like hands-off natural winemaking that can create some great wines, but some like shitty wines. Like, well, you probably actually should have added acid, or maybe you should have kept it in more of an oxygen-resistant environment. Like, I mean, no problem with the natural wine movement. And then there's the other side, which is like paint by numbers, or winemaking by numbers, and that's boring. Like, so if those are like the outer edges, then like find some way. Like, what do they call it? Like husbandry. That's what we call it with animals, right? Where it's like you're not like pulling the baby, you're not pulling the calf out of the cow, but you are there to assist should something go wrong. And it's like, that's a good winemaking approach. So like, probably with Il Bastardo, I was an absent father. I'm like, this kid's gonna grow up on his own, he'll be fine. He'll be eating solid foods at 6 months, foraging for mushrooms and tripping on them, meeting God. Il Bastardo died a very premature death. Okay, so that's failure in experimentation. Success in experimentation, this goes back to Randall Graham. So I got to meet with Randall once, and this is like in the first year of opening Enso. I kind of, like I was a big fan of his, but I didn't feel like there was any way that I could talk with him. I mean, especially back in the day, he was a rock star. Like it'd be like me calling Jim Carrey, who's a big hero of mine, and be like, hey, Jim Carrey, we don't really, like, I like spiritual stuff, you do too. I like humor, you do too. Like, maybe we should get a drink. Like he'd be like, hey, thanks. I wrote a book a couple years ago. It was like a book of poetry, and I mailed Jim Carrey a copy. I know he's not going to read it. Although Jim Carrey, if you're listening to this, please check your mail, because I wrote a book called Good Morning Sleepwalker, and I sent you a copy, and I autographed it. It's not a Bible. I don't autograph Bibles anymore. I only autograph my own books. So thank you, Jim Carrey. You're a inspiration to me. So Randall Graham was my Jim Carrey, 15 years ago. So once Enso was up and running, I felt like, I could now sort of like reach out to him as a colleague, and I could be like, hey, like I'd love to pick your brain about some stuff. And so he acquiesced, and I met him down in Santa Cruz in his office, and we talked, and he goes, he's asking me like what grapes I'm working with and everything, and he goes, so no Pinot Noir, huh? I'm like, I mean, there's so much Pinot Noir in Oregon, like why, and there's so much good Pinot Noir in Oregon, like why compete? He goes, yeah, I get that. He goes, but there's this kind of Pinot Noir that's never been made in America. I'm like, okay, go on. He's like, well, apparently, when the DeConti family purchased the Romani estate back in like the 1500s, they made their red Burgundies with as much as 30-40% white wine grapes. They just do a field blend of everything. And I was like, well, that sounds like a weird rosé to me. He goes, no, it's the whole co-fermentation, co-pigmentation thing. The poets in that era write about these early Romani Conti Burgundies as being the most mysterious, darkest red Burgundies ever produced. And I'm like, I mean, okay, That's pretty cool. I mean, that sounds cool. So I sort of like filed it away. It wasn't like I'm going to go do this. Well, I'm working the bar one night. This is probably 9 years ago. I'm working the bar one night. This kind of middle-aged gentleman comes in. He's clean cut, and he's wearing like a members-only jacket. Really sweet disposition. He's like asking me some questions. Clearly, he's like at least kind of in the industry, or he knows some stuff. And he's like, so I noticed you don't have a Pinot Noir. I'm like, that's funny. Like, yeah, we don't really do Pinot Noir here. He goes, well, why is that? I'm like, well, same thing I just told you. Like, there's just so much of it in Oregon. Why compete? He's like, but there's so much good. Like, this is Pinot Noir country. I'm like, I get it. But we always have my friend Vincent's Pinot Noir on our menu. You know, we have a handful of extra wines that we curate, and Vincent's has always been one of them. It's truly one of my favorite Pinot Noirs in the state of Oregon. He goes, well, what would cause you to make Pinot Noir? I'm like, well, I heard this kooky old story from this kooky old guy in Santa Cruz about as much as 40%, let's say Chardonnay, and then the rest of it being Pinot Noir. He goes, huh. He goes, well, it's interesting. I own a vineyard on Lone Star Road in Oregon, and we just got our first crop last year. This year, you want a little Pinot Noir and Chardonnay? I'm like, so now I'm like, is this guy, I'm like, I don't want to put any money on the line. He's like, no, I'll tell you what, why don't we do like a ton? You pick out the blend you want, which we ended up going with 75% Pinot Noir, 25% Chardonnay. He brought it here, he delivered it to me. He's like, tell you what, if the wine succeeds, pay me. If it doesn't, then it was just a fun experiment. He goes, I can't give you these prices forever. This is Lone Star Road. Like, these are going to eventually be very expensive grapes. And they are, and good for him, because they were great grapes. So we did it. We co-fermented 75% Pinot Noir, 25% Chardonnay, and it made an exquisite, weird Pinot Noir kind of wine. And it was ridiculously dark, or like hyper-saturated. And now I understand that through the whole co-pigmentation. White wine grapes have the ability to suspend color and textural compounds on longer polymers than polymers. I think I was mashing polymers up with telomeres. Okay, so polymers. All right, you can get a longer chain polymer, which means that you can actually have a denser color wine. So cool. So we and it worked out, and people love the wine. We called it the Prince, an homage to the Prince de Conti, who didn't necessarily come up with this recipe, but I actually did find a book years later that documented the recipe of like 4 vintages of Romani Conti, and the highest vintage was 40%. Pinot Blanc, Chardonnay, maybe Pinot Gris, I can't remember. Of course, these are all mutations of the same grape. What is it? Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Chardonnay are all genetic mutations of the same grape, something like that. It was cool, and we've produced it a handful of times since then. It's only ever been like when he's actually had the grapes for us. So that was trying an experiment, and it's succeeding. So, yes, on the one hand, you have Il Bastardo, may he rest in peace. And then you have the Prince. So I never wanted to like play it safe. Honestly, my winemaking these days is way more playing it safe. And I'm okay with it, because part of it is like, after workshopping our wines over the course of 12 years, I do tend to know more what people like. And do we still experiment? Yes, but like, we don't experiment nearly as much as we did when we first started, and I'm okay with that. It's like I've found my genre or my genres, and that's what I like to produce in right now. And also, if somebody came up to me with some opportunity to do an off-the-wall wine, of course I'd do it. Like, I'm not dead. I just like, and I'm not even on cruise control. I'm just,
mature.
Okay. It's okay that Coldplay went from being kind of experimental, quasi-Radiohead in their first album or two, and then eventually they're just cranking out fucking great bangers. Like, no problem. Like, maybe you're like, oh, I'm not into Coldplay anymore. That's no problem with that either. But like, you find your lane, and yeah, you can still weave, but like, if you've got a lane that works for you, like, Coldplay does great anthemic stadium music. Good for them for figuring that out. You listen to their first album, there is nothing anthemic about their first album. Like, it's brooding and experimental, and so like, whatever, it's all great. Like, do weird shit, do normal shit, like, just try to do it with some integrity and with some, you know, that's all I'll say about that.
So you sold out is what you're saying.
I sold out, that's exactly what it is. I swear that's what, here, I'm gonna grab my bottle. You don't have to cut this part out. It's the reverse pee break. Instead of peeing, I'm pouring myself more rosé. I hope there's no timestamp on this video. I would prefer for people not to know what time of day I'm drinking.
This is totally after dark.
This is totally the middle of the night.
So once you're, backing up just a little bit, once you're here and you get the idea to start Enso, and this is tell me about the logistics of actually starting it, of finding a place and figuring out what exactly you want it to look like and getting it open.
Sure. So I'll approach this two ways. First as suggestion, second as story. So suggestion to, like, for example, aspiring urban, garagistes, like, just pick something and start doing it. Like, you will learn so much, and honestly, this is just good business advice and good life advice, which is just like, sure, have a plan, but like, just start, because you'll meet people, like, you'll get your questions answered along the way. Like, life is about living, not conceptualizing living. So starting a business is about starting a business, not conceptualizing starting a business. And so, it was a high priority of mine in the year before opening to just meet with everybody I could in the industry and ask them questions. Oregon tends to be a very collegial culture as far as wine goes. There aren't like a ton of winemaking or wine business secrets. People will share with you their stories. So ask the questions then, because if they could help you figure some things out in advance, that's wonderful. I knew I wanted to do it in Southeast Portland. I happened to find this place because when my firstborn was very little, we'd push him in a stroller past this block to go to Meat Cheese Bread, which is the sandwich shop next door, and has the best breakfast burritos in Portland. And so I noticed this space. I couldn't see inside because at the time that the previous tenant was here, it wasn't our big glass garage door, it was just like a steel garage door. But I had a sense that there was like some space in there. And when I saw a for lease sign go up, I immediately called the number. And again, it was like we were walking to get breakfast burritos. I see the number, I call the number. I mean, maybe it's okay to say that the universe or God or fate or whatever just works this way. You see a phone number, you just call a phone number. Like, there's nothing to lose in calling that phone number, right? Same thing with him asking me about would I want some grapes. He had nothing to lose in asking me that. He was just like, kind of, interesting story. Would you like? It's like, yes, and so we do things. And I find that, like, is it Rumi that says that? No, is it Einstein? Somebody said, I think it's actually Einstein, which this is really spiritually sounding for Einstein, and I could be wrong, fact check me later. You don't need to edit this, but I think it was Einstein who actually said that when you make a decision, the universe conspires to like work with you on that decision. And I don't know how religious or spiritual Einstein was, but I think there's something to that. Like, you just follow up on things. Like, somebody calls you like, hey, I've got a question about wine. You call them back, and like, you might end up getting some information or helping another person with information. So anybody that I knew that I could talk to about wine, I just asked them questions. I see this phone number for lease. I'm like, there's no harm. Like, let's just go look at it. We looked at it. I was like, holy shit, this is perfect. Now, when we started, we didn't have this rear cellar space here. It was just the front tasting lounge and then this barrel room that was our winemaking space. Like in the first year or two of being here, there was no space back here. Like it was barrels on the wall, it was case goods, it was an office. Once we started realizing that people love doing private events here, we basically took over that 2,000 square foot cellar and put all of the kind of tactical gear back there. So found this space, kind of roughed out what we'd do with it, what would be required in the rehab of it. It wasn't terribly complicated. The guy that I started this business with, he and I built everything here, like almost everything. There's a couple people who've helped us build some things since opening, but we just started. So as far as the broader story of Enso, which goes a year back before we opened the public, I was working with this guy at Arcane Cellars on the drives back and forth. We're like, this is a really long drive. We could be making one a lot closer to where we live. So we went through the entire process of getting his residential garage, TTB, OLCC, city, county permitted for making commercial wine. And so that was nice because that was a very low cost way to, we weren't paying rent, we weren't paying. And then once the wines were ready, that's when we moved into this space. I'll say years 1 and 2 were like, neither of us were getting paid. And he left the business, just before I think our second year. We weren't getting paid. This was a passion project of ours. The business was, barely making rent some months. But again, we were kind of early to the scene. We were not the first urban winery in Portland, no way. But we were, as far as I know, we were the first urban winery to take a more like cafe metaphor. Like, you're not, the experience of a winery for me traditionally is you walk through the front door, you go up to the tasting bar, you taste there, you buy some bottles, you leave and you go home. Maybe there's maybe there's like a slight upgrade to that where like they've got a picnic area out here and you could do it, they'll come through and pour. Our like I said earlier in this, like it was really about creating a space that people would want to stay at. Now, from a business perspective, it's brilliant because selling wine by the glass is so much better than selling wine by the bottle to go. I mean, like the margin is so much better. So from a business perspective, like that was wonderful. But also, again, from a cultural perspective, you're not just interacting with somebody at the bar. If you just want to be here and meet up with a friend and have no interactions with the bartender or the winemaker, no problem. So much of it was having a plan, but then responding as things come up. I had a business plan, I had a business model. Am I where the business model suggested I would be now? No. And I mean that I guess I only mean it in a good way. Like I can't think of a negative, but there were things that I couldn't conceptualize when we started. For example, the whole event space thing. Last year we did 24 weddings in this space. I never would have thought we were going to do weddings here. What a beautiful space to do weddings in, and it's in Southeast Portland. For the right size of crew, this is a great space for a wedding. But I never would have known that because when I started this, it was about making wine. No problem, that's great too. But when you start having the people say, oh, it'd be so nice if you could clear some of those boxes out and we could, do a dance party back there, like then we might get married here. It's like, oh, people would like that. That would be easy for me to give people. Like that seems within my interest. So there are sort of like ways along the way where we've adjusted business model or adjusted the perceived trajectory, and I'm happy about that. And also, if we adjust it and it doesn't work, most often you can adjust it back. life is so malleable. I don't know why, there's so many people with good business ideas, and I don't just mean just in wine. There's so many people with great ideas, but I think that they stop themselves before they ever do it because you fear il bastardo. But you have the opportunity for both Il Bastardo and the Prince. And you're gonna get both. Like on some level, you're gonna get both. And that's not even just in business, that's just life. You just gotta be comfortable with failing and succeeding. And some people are way more comfortable with one than the other. And it's weird that most people I think a lot of us are more comfortable with failing than succeeding, like the fear of and that's so weird to say, but I've had to check myself on that. Like now I'm thinking about a second location in Portland, possibly a location in Bend. I mean, eventually I'd love to open a wine bar in Mexico. I'm going down there next month to actually check out this new wine region in Mexico that I'm like, this could be fun. But there is, I think, a fear of success, or I don't know. That's not part of this interview. You don't need to cut it, but we don't need to go any further down that road.
We'll bring a couch next time, and we'll have some more conversations.
That's right.
About this. Part 2.
That's right. Part 2 is the Freudian section.
The bloodletting.
The bloodletting. Okay.
So once you're open and you're kind of experimenting, seeing how things work. Tell me about the bar aspect of it. Obviously, an urban winery, that's a big part of it. Is you can have different hours, you have different clientele, you have different. So tell me about making your client base, finding your neighbors, finding your people.
It's funny. When we first opened, we actually did a direct mailing piece to everybody in the neighborhood, which that's in line with it being a neighborhood bar. It's just a funny thing to think of, doing a direct mail piece these days, but it actually was really effective for just letting the neighbors know, hey, you probably didn't know, but you have a wine bar in your neighborhood, or a winery. We really would have identified more as a winery at that time, urban winery, versus and I don't call us a wine bar, it's just that, again, that's how a lot of people think about us. So, this is a little bit of elbow grease and dumb luck. The elbow grease is working here for 2 years, pounding the pavement, doing, off-site tastings, any sort of media that we could get, not paying ourselves, and then, figuring out what works and trying to build into that more, and then dumb luck. I didn't know that in I forget what it was, year 4, maybe it was year 3, Willamette Week named us Bar of the Year. That's dumb luck. That's not something that I could, and even recently we've gotten these bumps where suddenly we have a weekend where we're shit, we're basically understaffed and it's well, there was some meme that went viral. It's I don't have any control of this stuff. It's just people do it. And the whole Willamette Week thing was really sweet. And I won't talk too much about that, but, this guy from the Willamette Week emails me, says, hey, just want to let you know, you're one of the finalists for Bar of the Year. I'm that's crazy because we're hardly even a bar. But he's you're one of the finalists. Can I talk with you on the phone for a little bit? So I end up chatting with him on the phone for an hour. Great conversation, mostly around the culture of wine and how Enso has participated in, like I said earlier, kind of the casualization, the demystifying aspects of wine and the wine culture. And he really seemed to get that. And I appreciated that because, talking wine culture is different than just talking wine, or even just bar culture. Wine culture is its own thing. And at the end of the interview, he goes, "Well, just so you know, you're the only one I'm interviewing. You guys actually won Bar of the Year, but I didn't want to tell you that at the beginning." And he's like, "I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't share this until an article comes out in 2 weeks." And I was like, "Fuck." And I read the article, and he does say Enso really helped pioneer this approach, this Okay, so there were like two options before I got into wine. There was either like the serious winemaker, which no problem, like might make great wines, might make good wines, might make shit wines, but the culture is serious. And then there was like the other side, which was kind of the silly wine brand. So I think of like, they're not called this anymore, but like Naked Winery out in Hood River, like, you know, it was like Penetration Red and like, you know, it was silly. And I was like, I like humor, but like silly is like a little too silly for me. Like, show some fucking respect. It is wine. Like, this is like, you know, what the gods drank in ancient Greece, right? So like, let's not sully it too much. So like, I was like, how do you find an in-between or whatever? So I appreciated that Willamette Week was sort of able to capture that. And so, not that we were unique, but that we were part of this third way in wine that was not stuffy, but it was not cheeky. It was like, I don't know, authentic. It was boutique without using that word. Because boutique sounds like it could edge in this direction of stuffy. So, you know, like I said, the first 2 years, it was just me and my original business partner. He worked the bar as well, although he hated it. He was a great winemaker. He did not like people. Wonderful, wonderful human being, but he was like, I don't do the customer thing. But I loved it. So mainly I worked the bar the first couple of years, and then like as things got going, it was clear that we would actually have to add bar staff. Deeply uncomfortable for me. I was the curator of the brand, and I remember like this gal who was kind of advising me on this. She's like, your employees are the most important part of your business. And I was like, I just don't know that I want employees. Like, but I had young children. Like I couldn't be here all the time. And so eventually I hired employees, and the first couple of years was definitely a huge learning experience for me. I made a lot of rookie mistakes. I gave perhaps way too much autonomy, or perhaps I clamped down way too much about certain things. But I think that I can say that over the last, let's say 6, 7, 8 years, I would say that the employee culture at Enso is again something that I'm very proud of. Logistics are just logistics. Like, okay, you have to train this person to talk about this wine this way, but I actually don't get into that too much. I will taste my employees on the wines and tell them my thoughts. I write all the tasting notes for the flights and stuff like that, so it's not as though I'm not here. It's just that after I've told my employees what I think about it, I let them talk about it the way they want to talk about it. Like, I'm honest with customers. Like, the Zinfandel Petit Syrah blend that we have right now, l'Americain, it's my least favorite wine on the list right now. There are people who love it, who go apeshit over it, and who will only buy that wine. But like, so if a bartender's like, I don't really care for that one, I'm not here to be like, well, you can't say that to the customer. I mean, there's always a way to convert liabilities into assets, Oh, it's just a very earthy wine. Oh, it's just so unique.
It's just a little gunpowder.
Just a little sulfur, just a little gunpowder. Oh my God. That person really did not like that comment. So, some of this is like, tell me how to write with a pencil. You probably couldn't do it because it's just muscle memory now, right? Or you'd have to think really hard to describe how to write with a pencil from ex nihilo, from nothing. There's just so many things that have happened over the last 12 years that it's in my body now. And I still make mistakes. I came in yesterday and the bartender had not locked the door the night before. The door was completely open or completely unlocked. Luckily the alarm system was on. And I immediately just like go off on everyone. I'm like, who did this? Like, why? And like, as it turned out, it wasn't even a person in the text thread. It was a person who subbed in for a bartender that night. So do I still make mistakes? Yes. I'm sure that I will still make a couple shitty wines before I'm done with this. I'm sure that I'll offend a handful of people, but mostly it's good vibes here and good wines.
So in the progression of things, you've talked about some of the milestones, obviously, getting to the point where you're getting some good publicity, getting customer base, hiring employees. Tell me about 2020 and what that does to sort of the growth of your business and how you responded to dealing with all the things that came in 2020.
Like I said, I had a handful of careers before winemaking. By 2019, I was fucking burnt out. No, probably like by 2017 I was burnt out. So at that point I've been doing this for 7 years. So it definitely was like a 7-year itch kind of thing. I was on the road a lot in 2017 for this kind of second brand that we had created called Portland Sangria. It's like these canned sangrias. And I was on the road in multiple states and all over Oregon, and I loved it. I had a Jeep Wrangler at that time. Like I was like, it was like summertime, and I'm like driving to different cities with the top off, and then I'm the Portland Sangria guy popping open the cans, and it was awesome. But Enso was hurting because I wasn't here, because I was really, and I couldn't, I can see it in retrospect, but I couldn't see it at the time. All I knew was that my output did not seem to be generating the kind of results. Sometimes it seemed like my output was going into the void. And so 2017, 2018, I just had really lost my passion. It had become a business and not a passion project anymore. No problem with that. Like, in fact, every entrepreneur should know this, that like at some point it's entirely possible that you will lose the passion of it. You know, it's the same way in marriage. Like, you know, there's like the honeymoon phase of entrepreneurship is very similar. And, you know, then you're waking up in the morning next to your business and you're like, do I still love this business? Its breath stinks a little bit more than I noticed before. And so I definitely was experiencing burnout. And so we decided that we were going to list Enso for sale. Not the building, I don't own the building, but the business. Because it is a great business, and it has been a great business, you know. And we found buyers. And it took about 6 months to find good buyers, and about 6 months to really like tighten in on like, you know, what the price was going to be, what the, you know, arrangement was going to be, all the details. So found the buyers in 2019, early fall. In March of 2020, we had basically like a closing date for the sale of the business. Just like you would have with like a closing date of a house. Everything was in legal. Like the lawyers were like, we weren't even having the conversation. I mean, we were having conversations with the buyers, but all the details, all the like checking the boxes was happening in legal between our teams. And 6 days before the close date, Kate Brown issued the stay-at-home order. And so, poof, just gone. Truth be told, I had very mixed emotions about selling the business. I just knew that I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. Like there was, again, the amount of output required from me was just, it was just taxing me. I couldn't keep doing it. And I didn't know how to, you know, whether it was set boundaries or I don't really know. I certainly didn't know then, except that something needed to change. I needed to have less responsibilities. And so we listed the business, we found the buyers, and then 6 days before close, the whole economy got shut down. And I know that, I read all the headlines. It's so interesting. This makes me emotional because I'm so beyond this now. Like it's very strange. Like it's a thriving business again. But I had really mixed emotions in selling the business, but I also knew that these guys that we were selling it to I felt would be able to take it to the next level. And in fact, I had this, fantasy, or not fantasy, but like this vision of like, I'd walk into Enso after these guys had taken it over and they would have improved this, or they would have improved that, or they would have brought vision to this thing that I just didn't have the vision for, or that I was bored with and didn't want to deal with anymore. And but when it happened, I was stunned. I was in shock for months. We were all in shock for months, like all of us, worldwide. And we made our way through it. There was this whole thing about how alcohol sales like went up so much during the lockdowns, and that's fine and good, but that was happening at liquor stores and grocery stores, and in maybe wineries that had like really, really well-oiled wine clubs. We had a wine club that was very small. Again, like I said earlier, we're mainly a place to gather, to meet with your friends. So it did really hurt the business, and we eked by. I mean, eked by. I will say this. So I laid everybody off except for me. I had this mobile bar that I rolled up to the front garage door and sold bottles to go for a few hours a day, 5 days a week. Maybe it was even 7 days sometimes, I can't remember. I think in retrospect, the few people that I would talk to are what kept me sane during the lockdowns. Because at least I got to talk with real human beings face to face, a couple times a day. And there were people who were literally in their fucking houses, maybe talking to people on Zoom, maybe not even that. So it's a weird gift that I got to be able to talk with people. It's July 2020 or June, I can't remember. I'm on an excursion out in the desert in southeastern Oregon. And I hear that Kate Brown has lifted the stay-at-home order. We can reopen. And so for the next 7 or 8 months before a new lockdown order is placed, I basically run the bar by myself. My wife helped with food kind of in the background, but like it was just me at the bar. So like, let me give like an overview of start to 2020. I started Enso in 2010. We opened in 2011. I worked the bar by myself for the first 2 years. The next few years, I'm in the mix of bartenders. And then, 2017, 18, I'm never here. Everything's automated. What's the word where you have other people do things? Delegated, thank you. It's delegated. I'm off in my Jeep Wrangler selling sangria, and then I'm ready to sell the business, and boom, I'm back at the bar. And it's just me. And wow, what a way to be dropped back into yourself. To be dropped, like time machine type shit. And I rekindled my love for this place because people would come, people weren't really sitting at the bar at that time. In fact, I don't think we were actually allowed to have people at the bar, but I'd still talk with people. And, you know, they'd say things like, this is one of my favorite places, or like, you guys have the best bartenders, or I love meeting friends here, or this is my go-to place for my first Tinder date. And I'm like, oh, this place like means something to people. And not that I didn't know that, but you know, when you create, whether it's art or business or children, you don't have full control of where it goes. You can be like, well, I did this for my child and this for my child, therefore their trajectory should be, fuck you. Like, good luck with that. Good luck with that. As a very rebellious person, good fucking luck with that. Lifes. It moves. There are emergent properties in all things. You can have the greatest, most waterproof, soundproof, disaster-proof plan. Life will still life. It doesn't care about your plan. And so I get to be reminded of that in 2020 that I wasn't here for those 2 years before this, but everybody still loved this place. It wasn't me. Yes, I had something to do with creating it. There was some elbow grease, but there's a whole lot of dumb luck and other people. And, oh, well, Ryan, clearly you trained your people so well. No. There are people I had to fire along the way. No, it's just that there are emergent properties, and people love Enso. And that second lockdown made me very angry. Made me very angry because us little guys were hurting that whole time. And sure, we pivoted however we could. We certainly did everything we could to pay rent. And it wasn't every month that we could pay rent. I tell you what, early 2021, I think Kate Brown lifted the second order Valentine's Day. And it's so funny because it's like, it's this announcement made like a week in advance or whatever. It's like, well, why not just fucking drop it now? Like, if you've made the decision to drop it, then just fucking drop it. Whatever. Maybe it wasn't Valentine's Day. I don't remember. And that's not even a political thing. We don't have to get into that. My politics have certainly broadened because as a business owner, you are subject to things that you didn't think the government would have intervention over, that has certainly changed some of my views around things. And I would imagine probably a lot of us have had that shift. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she lifts the order. Congress and the Senate, who'd been sitting on their fucking hands for a year trying to pass an act specifically targeted toward businesses like mine, finally passes it. So, despair for December, January, February of 2020 to 2021. And then it's like, and then we start having events again. And then people are feeling good about being around other people again. And it feels safe to be out again. And not everybody had their own timeline to manage, their own assessment of risk, and no problem with that. Like, that's just life. Like, everybody does their own risk assessment of everything all the time. So like, I'm just saying, people started coming back out. We started having events. We had a couple like micro weddings, like 12 people. We actually had a wedding here that they brought in a gigantic TV screen with a camera on it, like what you'd have in like a corporate office or something. And they were like Zooming with 60 people. And then there's the 12 people that were here. We made it work. I will say that we have come out stronger, leaner, more targeted to what we sense our customers to love about this place, clearer in our mission about what we do, clearer on the way that we value human beings, regardless of political affiliation, risk, tolerance, like, Enso is a place where you're okay. I mean, this sounds like Cheers, but it is a Cheers of sorts. No, I don't like that. Leave it in the video, though. But we have come out as a much more, our trajectory is perhaps clearer for the moment. And I am so grateful that I got to keep my business. I'm so, I was going through my own dark night of the soul with regards to all the ways in which I was required in my life. And all I could think to do was get rid of the business, pass it off to somebody else who could manage it. And I have no shame on that, Ryan, that felt that way. I was honestly doing the best I fucking could. It was like kind of a cry for help in some ways. But I'm glad that the forces around me basically said, we're gonna give you a break, but we're not gonna let you off that easy. Like, keep going, bud. And so now I have stamina for another handful of years, couple decades. I don't know. I'm not making a definite case around that, but I will say this. My 16-year-old son is now a W-2'd employee here. His first job is working here. He's not a bartender or anything. He works for me in the back. But I'm like, what a gift. Like that, like if you own your own business, like that's a cool gift to have. So I'm grateful that I was not let out of my contract with this place that I created.
We've had a lot of answers to that question in these interviews. That might be the most interesting one we've ever had. So thank you for sharing the story with us. I appreciate that.
For sure.
On that note, then, on this kind of like renaissance here, I guess, of Enso, what comes next? Are there things you're looking to do now? Are there things you're looking forward to, projects to undertake, new wines you want to try? Is there anything kind of on the horizon for you?
Yeah, there are. It remains to be seen which ones will actually click, but like a few ideas. First of all, Enso has always been an oral tradition. We have no like written staff manual. So one of the things for me this spring is to actually organize out a written tradition of our values, our processes, the responsibilities, and who takes them. We've always just had such a small team that it's never seemed required, but I think that at this point, if I want to scale the business into other locations, which, like I said earlier, I would love to open a second location, maybe Slabtown, I'm not really sure yet, but a second location in Portland sounds fun. And then a location in Bend, because I love Bend, and I think Enso would do really well down there. And then I don't know, I mean, I've got crazy ideas of like, well, if we can do it in multiple cities in Oregon, then maybe it could translate out into multiple cities in America. I'm not sure that I'm interested in that. Like I have to check myself on whether I really mean that. But then there's a handful of other options that are interesting. So the zero proof thing is really big right now. And I'm not trying to throw shade, but I've not had a single zero proof or low proof wine that has been in any way drinkable. So I'm curious about that. That seems like that could be a fun nut to crack. Like if you could actually, now here's the thing. Wine just might not be the beverage to do that. Wine is a highly aromatic product. Well, what pushes up the aromas in wine? Ethanol. You remove the ethanol from the wine, like it just might not be possible. Or, you might have to introduce like the terpenes or something else to like elevate aroma. So like that's an interesting project. An interesting sub-project of that would be like, well, Portland Sangria my other brand, it's half proof, so it's 6.5%, because it's half rosé, half juice. So that could be an interesting product to try zero proof with. So that's a possibility. I think that probably like gives away whatever ideas I have right now. I do think that like what we've realized in the last probably 4 or 5 years is that Enso really is an event space. Like, people love having their events here. So if I do open a second Enso in Portland or an Enso in Bend, that will definitely be a large part of it, whereas that was never part of the original business model. But that's not really doing anything different than what we're doing right now. It's more like, okay, maybe we need to operate more like a venue, because venues have certain things, like, for example, a written tradition instead of an oral tradition. And while people might love the idiosyncratic nature of like, oh, well, Ryan, he's kind of squirrely, but like, the event was great. Like, I probably need to like, distill that down to like, oh my God, this was like 5 years ago, but there was an event scheduled back here in the barrel room, and it just was off my radar. I just completely forgot about it. And so I was like forklifting barrels around. There was like wine on the floor. My forklift was parked right here. And the client shows up. They're like, hey, we're here for the rehearsal dinner, birthday party. I don't remember what it was. And I'm like, no problem, just cleaning up right now. Drive the forklift back there, get the mop. And I was like, okay, that can never happen again. But that's just like, this is a multi-purpose room. We make stuff here. We host people here. Like, it's hard to do a lot of things in one space as a business. And I think transitioning into like, we are an event space means that like we have a way that we prioritize. Like, for example, we have not made wine in this room for, I think, 4 harvests now. We do it in the back room now, which means that we have to do temp control back there. But that's because people love getting married and doing events in early fall. So we can't have grapes in here. So it's like, well, this was our winemaking room. Like, we literally have a trench drain right there and no drain in the back. So, there's just like things that we have to mess around with to make that work. So that's what I'd imagine to be. On the horizon for Ryan is travel and Mexico.
Travel for fun.
Travel for fun and for research. Like, going down to Ensenada next month is for fun. I'm going to be there with 3 of my best friends, but also we're going to Valle de Guadalupe, which is the up-and-coming wine region in northern Baja, because I want to see what they're up to. Like, there's still so much that one can learn about wine and about how people, it's like, I just love going and being like, oh, you do that. That's, whether it's with winemaking or how they host people or how they do tastings, like, it's like, oh, what a cool idea. Like, we should try something like that. Or maybe we don't.
So tell me about the Oregon wine industry, and especially the Portland wine industry, and how you've seen it change since you've been here. What does the industry look like to you now in 2023? Okay, so big disclaimer is that I'm the wrong person to ask about that. I don't really participate in anything in the Oregon wine industry anymore. And that's not like a, I don't need to, it's not that at all. It's just like, that's just not my life. When I started Enso, I was heavily involved with starting the PDX Urban Wine Group, with Hip Chicks Do Wine and Groshaw Cellars. I was a big proponent of that for the first several years. I think when my burnout started to occur, I did start like cutting off some things. Not in mean ways, but just like, okay, I don't really need to keep doing the PDX Urban Wineries thing. Like, they're doing great. I don't need it. They don't need me. I stopped going to any sort of like, wine festivals or wine industry stuff. Like, I just kind of pulled out of all of it.
There's a lot of things I enjoy that are not wine. Like I make music, I write poetry, I go camping a lot, and no problem with the wine industry. It's just I'm just not like it's not a very big definer of me. And that's not to say that Enso is so remote or such an outlier in the wine industry. No, we're probably not. It's just that Ryan Sharp is an outlier in the wine industry in some ways. But what I said earlier, I still believe wholeheartedly is that predominantly Oregon and certainly Portland is very collegial. So there's a great book about Napa Valley wine culture, or the two cultures of the Mondavi brothers. So the book's called House of Mondavi, and it talks about Robert Mondavi's approach to the Napa wine industry, and then what was his brother's name? David, Michael, Larry?
It probably wasn't Larry.
So his Italian family, probably not Larry. Hey, Larry! So Robert was definitely like the personality, he was like, he was the face of the Mondavi winery. His brother, Peter, was his name, I believe, Peter Mondavi, was the chemist. He was the winemaker. And there were apparently these two very different cultures in Napa this probably would have been like, I'm guessing like late 60s, mid 70s maybe, or maybe even like mid to late 70s. And Robert was kind of like there are no secrets in the wine industry. And Peter was like, we have trademarked, ways that we do these things. And maybe I'm getting them crossed, but I don't think I am. It's been a long time since I read the book. But Portland, Willamette Valley, Oregon, in my own experience, has been very collegial, very, shit, I need a pump. Let me borrow yours? Yes. Fuck, my filter's jammed and I have no idea how to clean this out. I'll come over and help you. Like, this is not unusual. And I love that. I don't know what Sokol Blosser is like now. That is, I haven't checked in on them in the last few years, but like, I read Susan's book when I first moved here 15 years ago. It was so refreshing. And her two kids are awesome. Like, I love those guys. Alex and Allison, is that right? Good people. That's it. I'm not saying that everybody in the wine industry is like good people. I'm sure there's some assholes out there because there just is always going to be assholes. I haven't met them. Like, mostly the people in the Oregon wine industry, and I even mean beyond just wineries, like even like the wine distributors, like, we're good people. Like, it's generally like respect first, like make some jokes, just be good people. Like, I feel like that is part and parcel of Oregon wine culture. And this has been written about. I'm aware that this isn't just my conjecture about the Oregon wine industry. Like, this is actually something that set the Oregon wine industry apart from where the California wine industry was headed or heading. And what really attracted me to starting my retirement dream in Oregon instead of waiting to get 65 and go back to California, I'd have no problem going down to Mariposa. That's such beautiful country, but I don't know where it's going. I mean, I love the, Oregon brand. There are several Oregon brands that are, they're very innovative. We take the production of the product quite seriously, but our branding might be silly without being cheeky. Like, I think Fossil and Fawn, like, amazing branding. It's all like pun driven, but these are like solid rustic wines, like, and I mean rustic in the best sense of things, like dry farms, low intervention, just soulful wines. And I'm not sure, Yeah, soulful is great. Soulful. Actually, I kind of feel like the Oregon wine industry is kind of soulful. I like that. I don't know where it's going. I'm kind of out of touch with it. I'm happy when I do get back in touch with those people. But again, I have a lot of interest beyond just making wine.
My last question kind of comes off of what you were just talking about. Other passions. You mentioned your book of poetry. Tell us what else you're doing and hoping to do with your life in the next couple of years.
Woof. Okay, so yes to the book of poetry. In fact, I'm about to publish my second book of poetry. My first book. What's that?
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's cool. The first book of poetry was definitely a pandemic passion project. It was like I had time to be with my thoughts, as we all did, and so I chose to write them down and put them into poetry. So writing has been a big deal for me. I've been making music quite a bit in 2023, which is the first time in a very long time making music. I realized a couple mornings ago, like I'm at my computer, I'm like putting this song together, or I'm like making the mixing edits on it, and I'm like, oh, I was just born to create. Like it's like, Ryan, what do? I make shit. Like, I build shit. Like I've got 3 paintings happening at my house, right, or my apartment right now, like 3 different paintings where I'm like, they're not done yet, like, and they're not for anybody else, they're just for me, right? I make wine for people, like, I like to make stuff. That's who I am. I will say this is not about making things. I'm thinking about going full-time camper van later this year.
Nomadland?
Well, Nomadland. Now I realize the distinction between being homeless and at the edge of, poverty or whatever, and owning a camper van and doing this thing. It's kind of this weird, do you know that in Spanish there's no word for camping? It's hacer camping. Because the idea of camping, it's not like it's so American. I mean, it's very European too, but the idea of like feigning homelessness for a few nights. Now, I think we can go back a lot further than that and say, well, it's actually feigning early tribe life. I think that's what, like when I go out with my best friends and we do a camping trip, that's what we're doing. We're feigning early tribe life. And awesome. Remarkable even. So I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to do the van life thing, but I'm curious about it. And I've been like, well, if I do this second location in Bend, then that would keep me from having to like have a second apartment in Bend. Like I could just like drive my home with me. My dog would come with me. That has nothing to do with wine, music, or poetry, but it might be the venue, it might be the space in which I create my next idea. I do like changing things up in some ways to provoke. It's like life stirs the pot enough, but every once in a while you choose to stir the pot yourself. And so I do think that if I got a camper van, that would be a big stirring the pot for me. So we'll see. I don't know.
That is amazing. And a perfect way to end this. All the questions that I have for you, anything that I didn't ask that I should have, anything we didn't cover that you'd like to cover today?
Oh no. We covered a lot today.
Well, thank you so much for your
I'd
time.
like to apologize to our viewers for...
I was just going to say, thank you so much for joining us for the first of our 8-part series.
I know.
Right, with Ryan. We'll be back for more.
Netflix is already picking this up.
We'll be back for more. Thank you so much. Really do appreciate
of course.
taking the time,
so
telling the stories. Thanks for the hospitality. Thanks for the canine company here as well. We'll let you off the hook.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.